Before George Washington led a nation, he was just a boy with a hatchet and one unforgettable moment of truth. This is the legendary story of the cherry tree, and the courage it takes to be honest, even when it's hard. Hey friends! If you love timeless stories with powerful lessons, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales every day. Now, let's begin. The sun had just begun to rise over the rolling fields of colonial Virginia, casting a soft golden light across the hills and forests. Morning birds chirped their greetings to the day, and dew sparkled on the grass like tiny diamonds. In a small but sturdy farmhouse near the banks of the Potomac River, a boy named George Washington was waking up to another day of childhood adventures. George was not just any child. Even at 6 years old, he stood with a quiet confidence, his eyes full of curiosity and wonder. His dark brown hair was often tousled from sleep, and his hands were always a bit dusty from running through the outdoors. He had a deep love for nature, and every rock, stream, and tree seemed to speak to him. The Washingtons were not the richest family in Virginia, but they were respected. George's father, Augustine Washington, was a man of strong character, a landowner and farmer who taught his children the importance of hard work, self-discipline, and honesty. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, was equally devoted, a woman of grace and faith who believed deeply in raising her children to honor truth and kindness above all. From a very young age, George had been fascinated by tools. He would watch in awe as the blacksmith hammered glowing metal into shapes. He spent long afternoons studying the way the farmers handled their scythes and axes. But there was one tool that caught his attention more than any other: his father's hatchet. It wasn't a large hatchet, but it had a polished steel blade that shimmered in the sunlight. The handle was worn smooth from use, and George loved how it looked like it had stories to tell. Every time his father used it to trim trees or chop wood, George would sit nearby, silently watching and imagining himself wielding it one day. On a crisp autumn morning, with the leaves just beginning to turn orange and red, Augustine Washington surprised his son with a gift. Wrapped in a piece of cloth and tied with a leather string, it felt heavy in George's small hands. When he untied it and the cloth fell away, George's eyes widened. It was a brand new hatchet, smaller than his father's but made with equal care. The handle was crafted from hickory, light yet strong, and the blade was sharp and gleaming. "This is for you, George," his father said with a smile. "You've shown that you're responsible and careful. I think it's time you had your own." George could hardly believe it. He held the hatchet close, almost reverently, and nodded. "Thank you, Father. I'll take good care of it." The days that followed were filled with joy. George would wake up early just to practice with his new hatchet. He started by chopping twigs and small fallen branches. He learned to judge how thick a piece of wood was, where to strike, and how to be patient rather than forceful. His father had taught him that tools were not toys, they were extensions of one's character. How one used them showed who they truly were. But being young, George's imagination was boundless, and with it came temptation. He began to wonder what it would feel like to use the hatchet on something bigger, something stronger. A small voice inside warned him to be cautious, but another, louder one filled with childish curiosity, pushed him forward. One afternoon, as the air hung warm and still, George wandered to the edge of the family's garden. Beyond the vegetable rows and berry bushes stood a line of young fruit trees, carefully planted and tended by his father. Among them stood a particularly lovely cherry tree. Its trunk was slender but healthy, its bark smooth and grayish-brown. Tiny green leaves rustled in the gentle breeze. George walked around it slowly. The tree had always stood quietly, never demanding attention. But now, with the hatchet in his hand, it seemed to glow with importance. He looked around. No one was nearby. The workers were in the fields. His siblings were inside. His parents were out riding to visit a neighbor. He stepped closer. The smoothness of the bark called to him. His fingers tightened around the handle of the hatchet. His heart beat faster. "Just one small cut," he whispered to himself. "Just to see." The blade met the bark with a crisp, clean sound. A pale wound opened. Something about that sound excited him. He struck again, harder this time. Then again. The wood cracked and split. Sap began to weep from the tree's flesh. Within minutes, George realized what he had done. The cherry tree leaned unnaturally to one side. Its bark was torn and damaged beyond easy repair. Guilt rushed into him like a cold wave. He dropped the hatchet and stepped back. He didn't feel powerful. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt something unfamiliar: shame. The following day, George's father returned from his visit. He walked the grounds as he often did, checking on the animals, the fences, and the garden. As he reached the cherry trees, he stopped. His eyes narrowed. One of the trees was badly wounded. Augustine approached it slowly, taking in the gashes in the trunk, the bent posture, the broken branches. This wasn't the work of a storm. No animal could have done it. These were hatchet marks. He turned and called out for his children. George came walking toward him, his head low, his hands behind his back. "George," his father asked calmly, "do you know what happened to my cherry tree?" George didn't speak right away. The wind rustled the leaves. A bird chirped from a nearby fence post. The silence between father and son was heavy. Then, George lifted his chin. "I cannot tell a lie," he said quietly. "I cut the cherry tree with my hatchet." Augustine's face did not darken with anger. He looked at his son for a long moment. "You did?" "Yes, father. I didn't mean to kill it. I just wanted to try it. But I was wrong. I'm sorry." Augustine took a step forward. His voice was soft now. "I am sad for the tree, George. But I am proud of you. You have shown me that your heart is more valuable than any orchard." That day became a turning point in George Washington's life, not because of the cherry tree, but because of the truth. Honesty was no longer just something he had been taught, it was something he had chosen. And that choice shaped everything that came after. Years passed. George grew older, stronger, and wiser. He studied surveying, learned discipline through hard labor, and eventually led men in battle. He stood tall with courage, even when afraid. He made mistakes and faced failures, but he did not run from truth. He learned to lead not with pride, but with purpose. When the time came for the country to choose a leader, people remembered not just the general, but the boy who told the truth. The boy who stood before his father and took responsibility when it would have been easier to lie. That story spread, and even if some doubted whether it happened exactly as told, the truth behind it remained powerful. Parents shared it with their children. Teachers told it in schools. It became a symbol of what it meant to be truly great, not because of victories, wealth, or fame, but because of character. And so, the tale of George Washington and the cherry tree lived on. After confessing, George Washington didn't expect forgiveness to come so easily. For a while, he still felt the weight of what he had done. Every time he passed the spot where the cherry tree once stood tall and proud, a small ache would rise in his chest. His hatchet had been carefully put away, not as punishment, but as a reminder. Some tools were meant for hands that truly understood responsibility. But his father never brought it up again, not to scold, not to embarrass him, and not even to joke. The lesson had been taught and learned. It wasn't the kind of lesson a boy forgets. George had learned that doing something wrong is never as damaging as trying to hide it. That a broken tree could be replaced, but a broken trust might never fully grow back. Over time, something in George changed. He walked straighter. He spoke more thoughtfully. When other children lied to avoid trouble, George stayed silent, or simply walked away. He had made a choice, and once made, it became a part of him. Life in the Washington household was far from easy. The family lived with modest means. Augustine Washington managed several properties and traveled often to oversee their care. When George was just 11, his father passed away unexpectedly. This loss hit the family hard. George's mother, Mary Ball Washington, was left to raise the children on her own. She was a woman of immense strength. While she could be stern, she had great faith in her son's potential. She kept a tight household and expected obedience and honesty, just as her husband had. With his father gone, George stepped into responsibility much earlier than most children his age. He helped his mother manage the home, the land, and the younger children. The values his father had instilled: truth, hard work, respect, were now enforced by the steady, determined voice of his mother. The cherry tree moment had faded into the background, but its lesson echoed in his every decision. When a neighbor's fence was damaged, George offered to help repair it, even though no one had asked him to. When a worker on their land was accused of stealing eggs, George quietly observed and later discovered that raccoons had been getting into the henhouse. He spoke up, and an innocent man was spared punishment. Each of these moments, small as they were, added weight to the kind of man George was becoming. By the age of 15, George began studying to become a surveyor. This meant long hours on foot, exploring unfamiliar lands, measuring terrain, and drawing maps that would guide settlers and leaders alike. It was a job that demanded precision, observation, and honesty. A misstep could mislead an entire town. An exaggerated measure could bring ruin. George was excellent at it. Not only because of his skill with numbers or maps, but because people trusted his word. He never cheated a line. He never guessed a boundary. When he returned with his surveys, landowners nodded in approval. They knew they were looking at the work of a boy who would never trade truth for comfort. These small acts built his reputation. Though still in his teens, George was invited to important meetings, trusted with responsibilities that men twice his age might envy. And still, he never let it go to his head. He worked quietly. He carried his notebooks with care. And whenever someone asked where he'd learned such discipline, those closest to him thought of the cherry tree. As the years passed and tensions between the American colonies and British Crown grew, George's path led him toward the military. He was appointed as a commander in the Virginia militia, and soon found himself in the thick of the French and Indian War. War was not like surveying. It was noisy, dangerous, unpredictable. Orders could change in a breath. Fear lived in every footstep. But the lessons George had learned as a child followed him onto the battlefield. He never gave false hope. He told his soldiers the truth about their odds, their positions, their supplies. When others promised victories, George promised effort. When others blamed their men, George took the responsibility upon himself. He wrote letters home not just to his superiors but also to the families of fallen soldiers, carefully and honestly explaining what had happened. His words were filled with dignity and respect. He understood the power of truth, not to hurt, but to honor. And even in war, he remembered the value of restraint. He never struck recklessly. His hatchet had once ruined a cherry tree, but now he wielded decisions like a man who understood the cost of every cut. Years later, as America stood on the edge of revolution, George Washington was called upon again. Not just as a general, but as a unifier. The colonies were fractured. Some feared war. Others demanded it. Some doubted freedom was even possible. In rooms filled with men who had read countless books, argued loudly, and owned vast lands, George was not always the most educated or the most eloquent. But when he stood to speak, the room quieted. Because George did not speak in riddles or grand declarations. He spoke plainly. He said what he believed. He spoke what was true even if it was hard to hear. That honesty, first planted in the soil of his childhood, now held the strength of an oak. When the war was finally won, and independence declared, the nation turned to him. They wanted him to lead, not just the army, but the country itself. And George said yes. But only because he felt it was his duty. Not his desire. When George became the first president of the United States, the world watched closely. There were no rulebooks, no instructions, no maps to guide this new land. Every decision he made would set a precedent. And yet, George did not waver. He remembered what his parents had taught him. What the hatchet had once taught him. That leadership is not about power. It's about trust. And trust is born from truth. He chose not to rule with an iron fist, but with an open heart. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions. He surrounded himself with people who would challenge him, not flatter him. He stepped down when the time came, even though many wanted him to remain. His life was not perfect. He made mistakes. He faced criticism. But even in old age, as his hair turned white and his steps slowed, people still told the story of the cherry tree. Now, more than 2 centuries later, the story of George Washington and the cherry tree is told to children across the world. Some scholars debate its accuracy. But those who understand the deeper meaning know that facts are not always the only form of truth. The story lives on because it teaches something powerful, that real greatness begins with a small moment, a moment of choice, when telling the truth seems too hard, but doing it anyway becomes the foundation of character. Somewhere in Virginia, beneath a sky still painted with the same sun that once rose on young George, cherry trees bloom. And though no one can say for sure which tree stood that day in the garden, what remains is even more important: the story of a boy who could not tell a lie, and became a man the world could believe in. His life was not perfect. He made mistakes. He faced criticism. But even in old age, as his hair turned white and his steps slowed, people still told the story of the cherry tree. Now, more than 2 centuries later, the story of George Washington and the cherry tree is told to children across the world. Some scholars debate its accuracy. But those who understand the deeper meaning know that facts are not always the only form of truth. The story lives on because it teaches something powerful, that real greatness begins with a small moment, a moment of choice, when telling the truth seems too hard, but doing it anyway becomes the foundation of character. Somewhere in Virginia, beneath a sky still painted with the same sun that once rose on young George, cherry trees bloom. And though no one can say for sure which tree stood that day in the garden, what remains is even more important: the story of a boy who could not tell a lie, and became a man the world could believe in.